Hello and welcome. I am Peter, and I'm excited to talk to you today about understanding college costs, which could help you save money. So, understanding the cost of college, I think, are one of those things that are widely misunderstood. And especially if you are getting prepared to do this because you have a kid or a couple kids, or maybe a household of kids that are planning on going off to college, you're probably thinking about it. And specifically, you're probably thinking about the cost of sending them there because as the prices of colleges and college experiences is very expensive. And so I wanted to add some information today that I think will help you as you go through that process. If you've already had a child that's applied and gone to college, and you're probably pretty familiar with it. But if you're anywhere from having newborns and you're thinking about it in the future up to having kids going maybe next year, we're in high school now and applying or maybe even accepted to college, I think there's some really good information here that will hopefully help you plan around the college expenses strategically. Now, I do want to say, I'm going to disclaim a lot of things here. I'm not endorsing any companies or brands or any particular strategies. You've got to definitely reach out to a professional, make sure that what you're doing is right for you. I'm going to talk about FAFSA, the free application for student aid, which is the process that a lot of people use when applying to college. And so the information, especially about the FAFSA process, the percentages that I use are all for illustrative purposes only. In fact, those rules change on a regular basis, sometimes each year, sometimes the percentages change. So really, I'm just going to give you a high level overview. But if you really want to use or explore any of these, please make sure that you're doing it with a professional that will guide you through your own unique situation. Now, some of the things that I want to cover today is I want to talk about the cost of college, explain what that is and how it's calculated. I want to talk to you about what your portion of that college cost would be and how that gets calculated. I'll talk to you about how the difference, any of the gap financially is made up, and then give you some ideas on what the next steps for taking appropriate steps to get your kid into college, get that college paid for could be. So first of all, what does college cost? You're probably familiar with the term in-state. So if you live in a state that has public universities, you can probably send your kid there. And because you're a taxpayer there, those state schools are usually a little bit more affordable. And in fact, to send a student in-state is an average of $32,000 for those 4 years. So quite a bit of money, but not as expensive as some of the other alternatives. For example, you could send your child to a state school outside of your home state, and it's going to be more expensive, average of $52,000 for that schooling. And then you could send your child to a private university, and the total cost there would be $65,000. And these are all in today's numbers. So you can imagine that if you have a child going off to college in 18 years or even a few years, that it's probably reasonable to expect those prices to be even higher at that time. College is very expensive. We know that, and it shocks a lot of people and scares a lot of people, especially when they think about how do I pay for this? So what goes into the cost of colleges? And there's a number of things. And the definition of what we call the cost of attendance, and that's how it's described, is the total annual amount to attend a college or university. And what goes into that are things that you might expect, like room and board. So they have to live in a place, and often when they're going away, it's a dorm. The board, which would be the food. Usually there's some sort of meal plan that they would be on. Tuition, right? The cost of sending them to actual classes, that pays for the salaries for those teachers. Books, obviously some of those, whether they're physical or digital, it's kind of a different world now. The supplies, you might need supplies for projects, taking notes and things like that, as well as personal expenses. They do some of their own social things, go out and have activities, have a life. And so all of these things kind of get rolled up into the total cost of attendance. And that's where those numbers can be pretty staggering. Now, one of the things is if you look at this, you might come up with some strategies on your own. For example, let's say you live near the university that your student wants to attend. You might not have to pay room and board. Maybe the student can commute to school. When I was in college, I had a friend, Kelly, who actually lived very close to the university. And so she actually lived at home, and that saved her money on having to pay for dorm and food and some of those types of things. But obviously it doesn't take care of everything, including tuition fees and the books and supplies. But there are some ways to, even when you look at the cost of attendance, to maybe get that down. Now, one of the common myths, or maybe misconceptions is a better word, is that the cost of attendance is the amount that you're going to have to pay. So when we look at those numbers, the numbers are shared with you before are sometimes thought of, hey, I've got to come up with that number. And if I can't come up with that number, my kid or kids can't go to that school. Well, those are the cost of attendance numbers. And that's the starting point for figuring out what you might be able to afford or where your kid will go. The second piece here is your portion and what you'll pay. And there's an acronym called EFC, which stands for Expected Family Contribution. So when you apply to a school and you go through the FAFSA financial aid process. You will fill out some forms, and this will help calculate what your expected family contribution will be. Basically, what they want to know is what is the financial state of your family or your household, because that is going to drive how much they determine you can pay towards it, if that makes sense. So your portion may be a much smaller number, and it could be the full cost of it. It could be a large portion of school, but that's going to be calculated independently of where you're applying in the cost of college. Now, that FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. You can actually start the FAFSA process and apply the year before your child is going to college. And one of the tips here is to apply as early as possible and get that done. So your expected family contribution, I want to dive into this a little bit more. So you are running your household, you have kids going off to college, and they are going to look at two main categories of your money. And one is income. So as you're working, you earn a paycheck. And if you're a 2-income earner household, you may have a couple sources of income. Maybe you have a business, whatever it might be. They want to look at those income sources because that'll be one way that they calculate how much you'll have to contribute to college. The other thing is the amount of assets that you have. How much money have you saved? How much money have you put in to your savings or checking account? How much money do you have in non-qualified or non-retirement brokerage accounts? How much money do you have in college savings accounts? Those types of things. And then they will look at those two buckets of money and use some math to figure out what you should be able to contribute towards college. And in the income side, they will generally consider about 22 to 47% of the income as available to the college expenses. And for your assets, they will expect you to pay and contribute about 5.64% of your assets each year towards school. Now, I do want to say here, a wrinkle is that if your kids or if the child who is applying to school and going to school has their own income and assets, those are calculated as well, but they're calculated differently, and they're actually calculated much heavier. So they expect kids' income and assets to be more heavily available for school. So that's a separate calculation. And like I said, we're just scratching the surface here. I'm just giving you high level. So, you'll know when you want to dive into these details, you're going to have to do so with a professional. Now, let me give you one example of a family here. Let's say it's a couple and they have one child. And there are a number of variables that go into this, including the age, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple here. Say a couple with one child and they have an income annually of $70,000 for the household. And they have some money saved and some checking savings accounts, investment accounts, and college savings accounts of $50,000. For this particular family, they would expect that $8,800 of that income will be available to pay college costs that year, and $2,000 of those assets would be available to pay for college costs as well. So in this case, each year, this family would be expected to pay about $10,800, right? So that actually might be less than a lot of people expect, especially kind of when they see the math handle. And you might say, hey, Pete, you just showed me in the previous slide that 22 to 47% of the income should go towards. So that number seems low. One of the things they do here, and again, you would have to dive into the numbers for your age bracket and for the number of people in your household. But what they do is they allow you to remove some of your income and some of your assets based on living expenses. So not every dollar you make is going to be counted. And so that's nice too, especially when you do the calculation for your household. Some people are surprised at their expected family contribution, that it might actually be quite a bit lower than they're expecting. Now, some people might do it too and find out that they are expected to pay for all of college, but that's definitely the other side of the coin in that case. So you might be saying, how do I calculate the EFC specifically for myself? One, they're online. There are a number of resources where you can look up kind of the rules for FAFSA for this year. There are some tools that help you just make an estimation of it. But if you are doing the FAFSA application, there's actually a worksheet where you will fill out a lot of different information. It's actually multiple pages. This is a screenshot of kind of that first page. You'll fill out all this information. It'll have you do some calculations, and it will tell you what your expected family contribution will be at the end of it. And there's a couple different models that you can use in this case, but it's all in the worksheet itself. So you might be saying, all right, I know the cost of attendance, school is expensive. I have now looked at my portion, the expected family contribution, and it's not going to cover all the cost of college. And so the college is expecting me to pay some of it, but there's obviously this big gap that they need to get paid for that I don't have the capability of paying. So what we're left with now is the financial need. And so that's what they call it in the FAFSA application. And they are going to help you plug that gap with a few different tools most commonly. First of all, scholarships. Now, as you might be familiar with these, You can probably apply for some. Maybe there's some academic or athletic scholarships. You may work for an employer that offers some scholarships for employees' kids or whatever it is. But those are pretty common, and those are usually counted as funding that can help plug that gap. Another one is student loans. And so these are very common. There's a lot of student loans out there. There's a lot of news about student loan debt. And so in some cases, what they'll say here is that you have this gap. What we will do is we'll make a student loan available to you. Now, there's a couple of ways that the student loans can be available. So there's some federal loan programs, as well as some schools will offer their own lending programs. And it's one of those things where, yes, it's going to help you plug the gap right now, and you're going to be able to get that child to school. But you've got to remember that in many cases, those student loans are going to have to be paid back at some time. Usually they will start being paid back after graduation. A third one is work study. So if you're familiar with this, I actually did work study for a year when I went to school. And these are typically jobs that are available on campus to students. Are usually relatively light work. And that's money that can get paid like payroll to a student that they are able to use, usually to cover some of the personal expenses. That is money that's earned that's counted as filling that financial need gap. And the other one here, and the big one, and the one that I probably somewhat underrated, is grants. There is a federal supplemental educational opportunity grant program, but you can get grants in a lot of different ways, including from the school too, and sometimes their endowment program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here, because one of the misconceptions that we have is that the more expensive the school, the more I will have to pay. And so a lot of parents sometimes think, hey, I don't even want my child to apply to that school. We just can't afford it. And the reality is some of the most prestigious schools, some of the most expensive schools, are usually the most well-funded with the largest endowments. They have the most resources. They have sometimes the biggest or richest alumni groups. Harvard's endowment is worth $40 billion. I saw some comments that they could pay for every student's entire cost of attendance through just the interest on their endowment, which is very possible. That's a huge amount of money. And what's even more common and springing up in more schools these days is a no student loan policy. In fact, here in Chicago, Northwestern University is known for having a no student loan policy. And that means that after they do the calculation and find out what you are expected to contribute, your expected family contribution, they will look at the remainder. And if it's plugged by some work study and some scholarships, that's great. But anything else that would have to be met with a loan, they will just grant you. So they are ensuring that students graduate from school without any student loans. And so that's pretty amazing. And usually the wrinkle is that it's the most expensive schools and the most well-funded schools that have these policies. So a couple tips here: be as competitive as possible. These schools are very competitive. They have very low acceptance rates. If you want to go to some of these schools, because that's a really big perk financially, you are going to have to be as competitive as possible, particularly your student. They're going to have to be an attractive student to the university as well as competitive with their peers, but also among schools. So when you're applying, one of the strategies out there is that you apply to multiple schools. Some people say don't apply to less than 5 schools, because that way, as those schools realize that, hey, you're applying to a competitor school, maybe we need to sweeten the deal. We want your student to come to our school. And so we will offer you something that we wouldn't normally offer you if you were only applying to this school. And then the other thing that is probably relevant here is to be as quick as possible with your application. So you want to start filling out that FAFSA form as soon as you are allowed to, and you want to get applications into schools as early as possible, because a lot of the money that they make available to incoming students is just provided on a first come, first served basis. So usually they will have a bucket of money, an allotment of money that's available. And if you are waiting till last minute or you're unsure, that money might be allocated already by the time they come around to you. So you want to be quick on things as well as be very competitive. So the benefits of starting early. One of the benefits of starting early, especially if you're thinking about having kids, you can start putting money away for college even before you have kids. You can start putting money away as soon as you have kids. And the longer that you have, the more likely you will be to be able to fund the cost of college on your own. In fact, if you start putting some money away as soon as you have a child, you have 18 years to save and invest. And by the 18th year or 19, 20, 21, as they're in school for a few years, you might be able to just pay for college out of pocket. You might not need any financing. You might not have to worry about FAFSA or financial aid. Your child or children can go to any school they want, which would be great. It's really kind of the best option for having the most freedom possible. But the benefits of planning, whether you're starting early or starting late, is that you might be able to take advantage of the system in a way that will keep the cost to you as low as possible. So for example, I said that when we're looking at what you're expected to pay towards college, one big piece of that is income, as well as your assets. The assets that have to be paid or applied to school might be as small as possible. Maybe if you have some deferred income or something like that might help. Obviously, reach out to a professional for that kind of advice. But on the asset side, they only look at some of the assets that you have available, your checking, your savings account, college savings accounts, investment accounts that aren't retirement accounts. So what they don't generally look at are some of the things like your retirement accounts or the amount of equity that you have in your home. So one of the strategies to consider might be to shift money from buckets that are counted towards college to buckets of money that aren't counted towards college to help keep your expected family contribution as low as possible. The nice thing about this is we're not necessarily making or deleting any money from your financial picture. So if you have that money and it's in a bucket that isn't counted towards college and you want to use it towards college, you might have that capability. So you might still have the money. You just might be expected to pay less towards college, which could be a nice benefit. So what are some of the tips and strategies and the next steps here is, like I said, this is just a high level. And what I would say is that especially if you're going through this process, it can be really beneficial to seek out the help of a specialist, a professional in this area. And in fact, even though I came from the financial planning realm, a lot of financial planners don't specialize in school and education expenses and savings. A lot of them will set up an educational savings account with you and for you. But if you really want to get into the nuance of what are the FAFSA rules, what are the criteria that schools use, and some of those things, you might want to get someone like a certified college funding specialist, a financial consultant, or a college planning specialist. These are people that are more in tune with what the current rules are and some of the strategies and can help guide you, especially if you are doing this a year or 2 or 3 before the child goes to school and you understand what generally those rules are going to be. Those are probably things that you're going to want to do as you're going into schools and starting to apply. And it can make a really big difference to how much you might actually have to pay out for college. So having the help of some of these people that focus on it and not just general financial people can be really impactful because the devil's really in the details here. Now, we covered a lot of stuff here, and hopefully it's kind of helped paint a picture of what you might want to consider as you're going through the college application and funding process. But I can tell you that we have only just scratched the surface. This is, again, just the disclaimer is that this is just a very high level general look at it. And so if you want to dig into the details about what money you might have to contribute or what money your student or child might own that they might have to contribute. And a lot of people sometimes have other family members like grandparents that are contributing money to college or friends or family and some of those things. And that's even treated differently. So there's a lot of different details and nuance that have to be considered in everyone's particular picture. And so I really encourage you to find a specialist or an expert in this field to reach out to. And hopefully that understanding of how college costs are borne by families will help you make the best moves forward so that you can send your child to the college they want and having it be financially affordable as well. Thanks for joining me.